welcome to Heritage Mississauga's Saturday Matinee. I'm Matthew Wilkinson, historian with Heritage Mississauga. And today we're going to have a little bit of a fun take down history lane, or memory lane, if you will, looking at some of moments of historic crime and punishment, a series that we call The Darker Side. And we're going to look at 3 short stories as part of this ongoing series, and over the weeks and months to come, we'll explore more stories of the nefarious side of history in the city of Mississauga. Every community has its stories of the not so good part of life, and we of course are no different. And so this series began originally as an article, 4 times a year article that's produced in Heritage Mississauga's publication known as the Heritage News. And we coined the term The Darker Side for the title of that series. Well, that gained tremendous popularity, has become one of the more visited things on our website, and we're looking at revisiting a lot of those earlier published stories to see if there are things that that have come to light since then, maybe resources we didn't tackle at the time. So these are fascinating ways to explore connections to local history. So as I said, for this presentation this week on the darker side, we're going to focus on 3 short dark stories, if you will, from our community's history. The first one revolves around the story of George William Silverthorne. Many of you will know or heard of the Silverthorne name, one of our earliest settling families, a very large family in time. The early realm of the family were three brothers who settled along Dundas Street between the Etobicoke Creek and what is now Cawthra Road. They were Aaron, Joseph, and Thomas Silverthorne. We're going to be focusing on Joseph's family, and principally that of Joseph's son, George William Silverthorne. Joseph built, George's father built a historic house that is still surviving in Mississauga, one of our oldest surviving homes, known as the Cherry Hill House. The Cherry Hill House is the scene of the whodunit, if you will. So just to step back in time, in 1849 or 1850, if you've heard the term the 49ers, where the football team in the NFL gets its name from, but the 49ers refers to an influx of people into California following the discovery of gold in 1849. And George Silverthorne was one of those people. He was born here in historic Mississauga in Toronto Township. He was the son of Joseph and Jane Silverthorne of Cherry Hill, just by what is now Cawthra Road and Dundas Street. Lured by the prospect of perhaps of striking it rich, of discovering gold, we're not quite sure what draws people away, but George William Silverthorne found his way to California, likely, according to a couple of things, leaving here in 1849 and arriving in California in 1850. He is back essentially to visit the family, but more focused on his nuptials. He was getting married in the spring of 1852, and the family gathered for the wedding. His bride's name was Louise Leonard. That's the name that it was given. She was of Indigenous ancestry, and either from, one report says from the Buffalo area of New York, another one says from the Cincinnati area of Ohio, but nonetheless, Louise Leonard is the bride's name that is given. So summarily, in the spring of 1852, with the ceremony taking place in Dixie Union Cemetery, or sorry, Dixie Union Chapel, George William Silverthorne marries Louise Leonard, and following the nuptials, the bride and groom and their family convene back at the groom's house. That's the Joseph and Jane's house, Cherry Hill House. And again, Cherry Hill still stands to this day. And they have a wedding dinner, a reception dinner for the bride and groom to commemorate this joyous occasion for the family. Partway through dinner, as the story is told, there is a knock on the door. And George's uncle, Aaron Silverthorne, goes to the door answers the door. A fellow on the outside who does not enter the premises, and therefore not many see him, they only hear the voice. He asks for George, and George goes to the door. Newly married George goes to the door. He has a few words with the fellow at the door, and then with a quick word of a promise of return, he closes the door and goes outside with whoever was knocking on the door. And that is the last they see of George. Time passes. George is absent from the dinner, if you will, and some accounts the Silverthornes wrote copiously about this, and thanks to local history author Kathleen Hicks, we have a lot of those stories recorded. Between 15 minutes and half an hour had passed, and George had not returned. And Aaron and Joseph and a couple of George's siblings rouse themselves as his wife is getting George's wife is getting worried, and they go outside to look for George. Going outside, there is no trace of George. They find a wagon wheel tracks departing. It had been raining, it was soggy on the ground, and they followed the wagon till they followed the trace of the wagon until they lost sight of it, or lost the clues. And so they were at a loss. They gathered the locals around. They began a search for George. Needless to say, George never appeared. For years afterwards, the family still searched for traces. They even dragged a nearby swamp at one point, trying to find evidence of George. George's new bride, Louise Leonard, stayed with the family for a number of weeks, finally, according to the family, returning to her own family in the United States. Whether, again, that was Buffalo or Cincinnati, we are not sure. But nonetheless, Louise Leonard returns, likely brokenhearted. You can imagine, and always unaware of what happened to George. Part of the challenge in the story is that George's parents, Joseph and Jane Silverthorne, never found out in their lifetime. The mystery of George Silverthorne continued, and he was never located. They never had correspondence from him. But that is not the end of the strange tale. Years go by. Joseph and Jane pass away in the 1870s, and somewhere in the early 1880s, a fellow by the name of George William Silverthorne, same name, surfaces in Shasta, California. And his wife's name is Louisa Leonardo, very close proximity to Louise Leonard, who he married in 1852. This George, some claim that he was an imposter who assumed the name. Others, in fact, believed it was the real George, and for reasons unknown, ceased to be in communication with his family, had married a second time, or registered the marriage a year later to the same lady who joined him in California in 1853. The area that they lived in came to be known as Silverthorne's Ferry. This is in Shasta, California. And George was a doctor, and made quite a name for himself, was quite a popular fellow in the community. And he, for some reason that we still do not know, an unanswered part of our history, if this is George Silverthorne, the son of Joseph and Jane, who disappeared in 1852, he never contacted his family. At least it's not known that he ever did. The family never kind of claimed closure on this case. Incidentally, his obituary, when Dr. George Silverthorne passed away, his obituary did list himself as the son of Joseph and Jane Silverthorne, early pioneers of Toronto Township. So he claimed in his own ancestry, in his own obituary, that he has this connection, but he never once reconnected with his family. And again, strange disappearance indeed. The why with the question mark is something we will never know. Why did he disappear? Why didn't he contact his family? Why did his parents have to go the rest of their lives without knowing what happened to their son? questions we will never have the answers to. So 1852, the strange disappearance of George William Silverthorne. The next in our quick story here on the darker side is actually the very first story that we uncovered as part of this series. It was a double homicide that happened in 1893, and like a kind of a good whodunit, if you will. That answer has never been conclusively that question has never been conclusively answered. It was referred to in the papers as the Middle Road tragedy. The Middle Road is the early name for the QEW. The Middle Road back then was a rural concession road, and the crime took place at the Williams Farm, which was on the north side of the Middle Road, north side of the QEW, and just to the east of what is here Ontario Street or Centre Road, just north of Port Credit, south of Cooksville. And the farm, again, fronted onto the Middle Road and stretched northwards from there. Mr. and Mrs. Williams had a 50-acre farm on the Middle Road. And on December 16th, 1893, an assailant entered their property, entered their house, caught them, Mr. and Mrs. Williams, elderly Mr. and Mrs. Williams, unaware, and affected their demise, murdered them. They were found in their kitchen, likely struck with a heavy object, bludgeoned, sadly to say. One of their neighbors, snow had fallen in the overnight hours, and one of their neighbors, not noticing lights or smoke from a fireplace on, went to check on them in the morning of December 17th, and finding the doors locked, he went to the back of the house and peered in through the window of the door and saw what appeared to be lifeless bodies in the back kitchen area of the house. He fetched the local constable, and the constable gained entry to the house and confirmed indeed that Mr. and Mrs. Williams were deceased. And it appeared that Mrs. Williams was struck multiple times with a heavy potato masher, and that Mr. Williams had been struck on the back of the head while seated at the table. It was believed that robbery was a motive. Unfortunately, the Williams were not well off, and if the assailants absconded with any funds, it was likely a very small amount. It became the buzz of Port Credit, and indeed the surrounding township, including Cooksville, for some time. This Middle Road tragedy, or the Middle Road massacre, as some referred to it. Suspicion fell on a number of individuals who were seen to kind of not fit in. They weren't all connected with each other. There's a little uncertainty. A fellow by the name of John Corey, who had been a hired hand on the property, and had either been let go recently or had simply left the farm recently and found employment elsewhere. John Walker and a fellow by the name of William McWhirl were, sorry, that's a hard name to say sometimes, but William McWhirl were seen as kind of drifters that were in the area that were looking for work. And another fellow, Robert Dutton, who admitted to knocking on the door at the Williams farm looking for employment. There's quite a bit of kind of confusion as to the connection of these individuals, and that was never conclusively proven, although there are some oddities around this case. The three of them were arrested, all but Dutton. Dutton was not arrested as part of this crime. John Corey pleaded innocent, and his alibi did seem to check out to the local magistrates, and he was freed. But due to circumstantial evidence, including a wagon and a horse were taken from the farm, the Williams farm, and were found in the possession, or at least nearby where Walker was found, which was rather inebriated in a hotel in Toronto. And McWhirl was arrested on suspicion, was found with what they believed to be stolen property on his person. The two, although not found together, were tried together and were both found guilty. The McWhirl came to a sudden end in the Kingston Penitentiary, where he died of a heart attack. His body was claimed by a young woman from Hamilton who claimed to be his wife. McWhirl was believed to be an alias, and indeed the wife had him buried in an unmarked grave in Hamilton Cemetery. And so we do not know the actual true identity of William McWhirl, but there are a number of suggestions out there in terms of who he might have been. Is a kind of interesting case to look in. Some people believe that McWhirl was an alias for a notorious gangster who was active in the community and happened to be caught up in this case, in a case of kind of accidental or mistaken identity. But nonetheless, McWhirl died of a heart attack in prison. They then re-looked at the evidence, and it was determined that there was not a strong enough case for Walker on an appeal, and Walker was released only to be mysteriously murdered about 2 weeks later in Toronto. And so McWhirl is released in the summer of 1894. He does not see the fall of 1894. And then the oddity of it all is Robert Dutton, who was not arrested for the Middle Road tragedy, but was arrested for stealing a bicycle in Colorado, of all things. So Robert Dutton finds his way into the United States. Seems to be probably not a great character of an individual. He is arrested for the larceny of a bicycle in Colorado, and while in jail in Colorado confessed to the Middle Road murders, as well as the murder of Walker in Toronto. And so Robert Dutton becomes this person of interest. However, he is facing a crime in Colorado and does not, for whatever reason, there is no evidence to suggest that he is brought back to face the question of the crimes that that took place here in Port Credit. A little bit of an uncertainty as to what happens with Robert Dutton. He is sent to jail in Colorado. What happens after that, we have lost him. So there's a good sleuth for anyone out there wanting to delve into this the case a little bit more, the Middle Road tragedy. It's possible we don't have all the kind of the strings tied up in a neat little bow here, but find out what happened to Robert Dutton in Colorado and after he was released there, because we have no evidence that he was ever brought back to Canada. And as for Corey, the fellow who did have a connection to the Williams because he was a former employee of them, and was originally arrested but then later freed because of an alibi. Corey leaves the country just after the murder of Walker. One of the newspaper that were this case percolated in the news for some time, and it was said that Corey departed for Boston, Massachusetts, of all places, in the summer of 1894, and that is the last we hear of him. So John Corey never hears the music. Whether or not he was a guilty party is uncertain. It certainly appears that Robert Dutton might have had fingers in this as well. But there is a possibility one of the newspapers recounted that maybe all four of them were somehow involved in this crime of opportunity. But regardless, for poor and elderly Mr. and Mrs. Williams, it was the end of the line for them in this double homicide on the Middle Road in December of 1893. Again, known in the newspapers as either the Middle Road tragedy or the Middle Road massacre. And the bank job. This is a kind of a case where the perpetrators of the crime gain the fascination of the public. It's kind of a not quite a Robin Hood type of moment, if you will, but these two individuals certainly did gain the popularity within the community, and they followed their movements with great interest in the newspaper. So 1903, the crime takes place at the Crown Bank in Arundel on Dundas Street. E.S. Banwell was a teller at the bank, and one of his jobs was to close up the bank on the end of the workday. On a Friday, Banwell did his daily job, closed the bank, left. The bank was not due to open again until Monday. Upon arrival on Monday, the opening clerk discovered that a robbery had taken place, and that missing from the vault was $1,487 in gold and $20,000 in unsigned banknotes. And Banwell was nowhere to be found. He had a 2-day head start, and he had left. Not only did he abscond with the money, but he left with his sweetheart, soon-to-be fiancee, soon-to-be wife, Miss Nora Hector of Arundel, and then the chase was on. Banwell and Hector were married in Buffalo, and the police, tracking their movements as this became an international case, were routinely a day behind them. They spent time in New York City. New York City, they purchased quite an exorbitant amount of jewelry. At the time, they made their way through Philadelphia, down the Atlantic seaboard, stopping in New Jersey, in Atlanta, and the police are kind of always on their tail, but always a little bit behind. They traced them to New Orleans, and Banwell and his wife were seeking passage to Jamaica on a steamship. Getting a wind of this moment, they decided to get ahead of the couple for the first time, and the police found their way to Jamaica and simply waited for the couple to disembark. They were arrested in Jamaica on January 19th, 1906, and they had been on the run for about 6 months at the time. It was quite an interesting thing to follow in the newspaper. And in a very strange twist of fate, it was public sympathy fell on Banwell and his wife Nora, and they began to look at them as kind of the guilty of a crime, but the crime of opportunity against the big bad bank, if you will. And so, even though the bank was pressing the charges and they were the ones who had been wrong, the public sympathies began to really focus on the young couple who were on trial. And the trial became a sensation. First of all, because the arrest took place in Jamaica, they had to be extradited back to Canada, and that was no simple task. Because they had purchased goods with stolen money, there were creditors involved in paying back and returning a lot of the goods that they'd purchased on their way, particularly in the United States. And so when the trial finally came to court, the couple had received a great deal of news coverage for their activities, if you will. One of the interesting things when you look at the trial through the newspapers was the focus that was given to Nora Banwell. Every column recounted what she was wearing, what her countenance was like, how she handled herself. Nora herself was not on trial. They determined that they would focus on E.S. Banwell, and so her husband was on trial, and Nora, although originally facing charges, had those dismissed, and she was in the audience as her husband was facing trial. And ultimately, E.S. Banwell is found guilty. Despite being caught with the goods and pleading not guilty. There are lots of holes in their story, to say the least, during his story. Banwell was found guilty of larceny. He was sentenced to 4 years. He served 3 years of that sentence. He was then released, and Nora and E.S. Banwell moved to California, in which Banwell got a job as a teller in a mining company, or a clerk in a mining company responsible for payroll. So an interesting, they ended up having several kids for a time. They lived in Northern Ontario. They eventually did return to the Arundel area, which were Nora's roots. The Hector family long entrenched in the Arundel community. So it's a fascinating element of a bank heist gone wrong. Well, not really gone wrong. A bank heist, or the perpetrators were on the run. They get caught, but the public begins to fall in love with them as the trial progresses. And so, again, crime taking place in 1903, arrested in 1906 in January, and then comes to a conclusion in the fall of 1906, where E.S. Manuel is sentenced to 4 years in prison. But that's the end of the great Arundel bank job or bank heist from the Crown Bank in Arundel Village. So that's kind of our 3 short stories for this week for the darker side. Hope you've enjoyed them, and by all means, keep digging, keep turning over the stones of the past and looking underneath and seeing what hides in the shadows, and share those stories with us. And we'll continue sharing some of the ones that we've uncovered with you. Thank you.